Welcome out tonight. Good to be with you again. We started this in January and it's already May. And so I'm not sure how long these will go on, but we still have a lot of scriptures to look at. So if you bear with me, we may just continue until we decide to stop, ever how long that is. So tonight is session number 8 overall. But you notice on the 3-page handout, I'm calling it Deep Dive number 2. And how I'm approaching this, we're taking the New Testament in sequential order, looking at each verse that speaks something about the end times and return of Christ. But as we move through that, there will be times that we'll stop and do a deep dive on a particular subject. We already did one on the Antichrist, comparing Christ and the Antichrist. We looked at many of the names of the Antichrist, how it's developed through the Bible. There's probably as much about him in the Old Testament as there is in the New Testament, maybe even more. Almost the entire 11th chapter of Daniel is speaking about him, along with many other verses. So that was our first deep dive. We devoted the whole session to looking at that. And last session, number 7, we got into this part of the board about the 4 days. So we talked about dates and numbers and events, and it stirred up quite a bit of interest and questions. And I know I just kind of like rushed through it. And so I thought it'd be a good topic to do a deep dive. So this is number 2, and I'm calling it Exactness of Time, God's Precise Use of Numbers. And so session number 8, May the 3rd, 2022. You'll notice in these handouts, they're much more detailed than the previous ones I've done for you. And I decided to do it this way because if you just look at it, your eyes start getting crossed. You see there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of dates, there's a lot of events connected to those numbers and dates. And I've learned the hard way, when you try to do that as a speaker, and you got all these dates and numbers and events that you try to just throw out there, and you kind of got it worked out in your mind because you're the one who prepared it. But to the listeners, all these numbers and dates and events just get jumbled together. You're trying to write stuff down and it gets really confusing. So I thought I'd just give you all the information. We're not going to be able to cover all of it in detail, so you'll have it to take home and look at yourself. We're mainly going to cover the 3-page handout. The other one, numbers in Revelation, are they literal or symbolic? This is something I put together a few months ago that I sent out to a group of people. So some of you may already have this. But I added this 1 page to the 3-page as just kind of a reinforcement. It confirms what I'm trying to get across in the 3-page handout. And so what I want to do is just kind of scan through it. Some of the verses we'll look at, some we'll just refer to, because I really do want to get through the 3 pages. And I start off with, 5 verses. There's probably 20 times that many that we could quote. But I'm just trying to establish this idea of exactness of time, how God is precise, and what that means when we study prophecy. So our theme verse, or our text verse that we started with in the very first lesson was Habakkuk 2:3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. And I underline that because this idea of an appointed time, you see a few verses in Daniel and Acts, it uses the word determined. So this idea of God determines not just what happens, but when it will happen. He's a God that's on a time schedule. He's kind of committed himself to a time schedule. And some of his times may have some variableness to it, depending on the reaction of people. But mostly he has this framework of time out there in front of him. We call it the 7 days. We call it 6 days and the seventh day. We looked at last week, we had 4 days, 2 days, 1 day, and then the eighth day. These are just kind of overall ways that God lays out this framework of time. So the vision is yet for an appointed time, and he's the one who appointed it. But at the end, it will speak and it will not lie. In other words, it will prove itself true. Though it tarries, wait for it. There's where the faith and patience of the saints comes in. Because it will surely come, the certainty of it, it will not tarry. Daniel 8:19, for at the appointed time the end shall be. So when will the end come? At the appointed time. Jesus said when he was here, and it may not be true of him now, but it may. We just don't know. But when he was here in the flesh, he said, of that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels, and in one place it says, neither the Son. That's really interesting, isn't it? We think maybe that he gave up some of his privileges when he took on a human form. And while he was here, he may not have known when his return would be. Only the Father, he said. Now that he's back with the Father in his glorified body at the right hand of the Father, he may know the actual time. Daniel 9:27, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, even until the consummation, which is determined. Daniel 11:36, for what has been determined shall be done. So, the sovereignty of God, the ability of God to bring about the events of the future on a particular time schedule. Acts 4:28, to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Now, as we go through these 3 pages, the second paragraph is really like the heart or the thesis of this handout. It's really the main point. All the details of the dates, the events, the time, the numbers, and all that, even though each one of them are very interesting and very important, but I'm trying to throw a lot of them at you to serve the purpose of this second paragraph. One of the underlying truths about exactness of time, of God working out prophetic events, is it puts on display a God with a grand plan on a time schedule, a God of order and precision, in contrast to Satan's chaos and disorder. The current events on the world, and that could be Elon Musk buying Twitter, everybody going crazy. It could be the leaked document of the Supreme Court about Roe versus Wade, and everyone's going crazy. Everyone's going crazy about everything. That's chaos and disorder. So the current events on the world and national stage shows both of these at work side by side. God's order, Satan's disorder. And Satan's using disorder to corrupt and erupt and cause chaos and confuse people. God's using the same events to bring about his purpose. It's pretty amazing. So God is allowing Satan to work his chaos and disorder in order for things to fall apart, because that's part of God's plan. Things are going to fall apart. But God is working in the same to take the pieces and put them together to a perfect and orderly government of the Christ during the millennium. So I asked this question many times. Are things falling apart or are things falling into place? And the answer is both. God will allow things to fall apart. They have to, in order for him to step in and put things back together. The thing is, our flesh doesn't want to live through the falling apart part. But he will give us grace to go through that, and then we will be part of that, putting everything back into place. So in session number 7, we looked at 4 main time periods, and I didn't number them the same way I taught them as far as 1, 2, 3, and 4. based on the 7 days of creation week. And in Genesis 1:14, he says, the sun and the moon and the stars are for signs and seasons, days and years. If you read that passage and then the one following, it's really interesting. He only says they are for light. I don't know if I would say secondary, but he says they are for light only after he says their main purpose is for signs and seasons. So prophetic nature to them, not just up there to give us light. They serve a much deeper purpose in God's plan. God then incorporates exactness of time, of days, of length of time to show the preciseness of his plan, to show he is sovereign, capable not only of bringing about his plan, but able to do it on an exact schedule of time, is still allowing for man's free will. So we looked at these last sessions, so just quickly. So we have the 2 days and the third day of Hosea 6:2. Those are said clearly. And if you look at that passage like we did last week, when do the 2 days start? That's the thing. What is a starting point? So you go back into chapter 15 of Hosea, verse 15, and it says, I will return to my place. So clearly that's his resurrection and ascension back to heaven. His death, resurrection, and ascension around 30 AD. So that triggers the start of the 2 days. And then we have the third day in Hosea 6:2 that clearly describes it as a resurrection of the dead. He will raise us up on the third day. So from the third day, we come to understand it represents the 1,000 years, millennial. So the third day is the seventh day overall, the Sabbath day of rest. And the Bible calls the millennial the time of rest, the Sabbath rest. So we're clear about that, and that's connected to the third day. So, we always have to be careful in the Bible of making numbers only symbolic of something different, like a day is 1,000 years or something like that. You have to be careful, but when the Bible says that's what it is, then you can be free to do it. So if the third day is 1,000 years, that makes the 2 days probably 2,000 years. And so we surmise that if he died and ascended at 30 AD and you move forward 2,000 years, we're just about there, aren't we? And Gary J has been sending me some interesting information the last few days about the Great Reset that we're all hearing about. And so I've done further study on that this week. The World Economic Forum, all the world business leaders, economy leaders, political leaders meeting at Davos. And their stated purpose is that the last couple of years especially, we have seen how governments, economies, healthcare systems have failed in their response to COVID. And included in that is the different systems of governments, communism, socialism, capitalism. Their conclusion is that they all fell short. So we need to develop a common system for all the major nations of the world so that when another crisis comes along, the reaction can be quicker, more unified, more effective. At least that's what they claim. And it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It really does. That's the deceptive. That's why Jesus all the way through kept saying, do not be deceived. Do not. The great quality leading up to return of Christ is deception. So you read something like that, you think, yeah, everything was a mess, upside down. No one knew what they were doing. Everything was not just confusing, but it's frustrating. Every time I had to try to contact my doctor, I just had to jump through hoops and wait too long, and something's got to be done. That's what everyone said. Something's got to be done. Well, the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, they're saying we're working on it. And so they're trying to develop a plan that will be accepted. And some of the information you do your research about the Great Reset, some of their goals seem to be connected to the year 2030. It's kind of like their aim. So, we're talking about exactness of time. We know the third day is exactly 1,000 years. We know the 4 days from Adam to Christ, the chronology that I follow, that I found to be the most thorough and accurate, is called the chronology of the Old Testament, Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones. It's really for nerds. I mean, it's really like heavy. You got to slog through a lot of history and dates and stuff for them to prove their points. But I have confidence in him, and he agrees with Bishop Ussher, and he says it was an independent study that Adam created 4004 BC. Jesus was born, what became, not 0, but it became 4 BC when we were better able to designate calendars and time. That's exactly 4 days. So that's kind of spooky when you think about it. If they are correct, that was exactly 4,000 years. We know the last day is exactly 1,000 years. So why should we not expect these 2 days between his two comings to be 2,000 years? Now, Gary surmised that if the Great Reset is designed to really kick in at 2030, could that be the same as the setting up of the mark of the beast, the breaking of the covenant, and all of that, which happens in the middle of the 7 years? So not only are these 4 days maybe exact, the last day is exact, the 2 days probably are exact, but this number 3 I put, these 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel is also exact. We're going to look at timestamps on those in a minute. So Gary surmised that maybe it's the middle that's about 2030. And I find that interesting. Instead of Christ returning at 2030, maybe it's the middle, because what happens in the middle of those 7 years? One of the things that happens, according to Revelation 13:3, is there's some kind of mysterious death and resurrection event of the Antichrist. So is it exactly at the 2,000 years that the great rebel, the great imitator, the Antichrist, in some way duplicates what Jesus did in 30 AD? That's a pretty big deal if that happens. And then Christ might return 3.5 years later, 2033, 2034. So that would mean the start of this, which is kind of a peaceful time in most ways, the signing of the covenant around 2026, 2027 or something like that. So, we don't know, but what we're trying to establish tonight is God seems to be very precise on so much of his timing, that what are we going to do with this? Are we going to say, well, it may be hundreds of more years? Are we going to say it's open-ended when so much of what we're looking at tonight is very precise? So let's continue. I already read that next part. These 4 periods we looked at in session 7 are, and we just went through them. I'm given other examples of exactness of time, such as Genesis 7:4, after 7 days I will cause it to rain. Well, when God told Noah 7 more days it's going to start raining, did he mean 6 or did he mean 8? No, he meant 7. So, is Noah just going to well, God, I thought you meant kind of 7, about 7. So I'm still not ready after 7 days. Can you give me a few more days? No. Again, I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And the Bible says that's exactly what not 39, not 41, 40. 7:13, on the very same day. I like the King James word on this, self-same. For some reason, I just like that word. self-same, seemed to have a little emphasis to it. Noah entered the ark. And when God established his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17:12, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. He goes on to say, whoever is not shall be cut off. You know, if you don't cut off, you'll be cut off. It's interesting. Would God accept it if you were circumcised on the seventh day, the ninth day? Did it have to be the eighth day? See, it's precise, isn't it? He's not saying, I'll leave it up to you. He's saying, I want you to put this on your calendar, 8 days after the birth, circumcised. Then we get into some longer periods of time. Exodus 12, 40, and 41 came to pass at the end of the 430 years on that very same day, self-same day. It came to pass that all the armies or hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. From a starting point to an ending point was exactly 430 years. And that starting point and ending point is clarified in Galatians 3:17. It was 430 years exact from the initiation of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, 1 through 5, and him entering into the land of promise to the law covenant, Exodus 19. So Floyd Nolan Jones places this when God initiated the covenant in Genesis 12 at 1996 BC. The second at 491. I don't think I have the right years on that. But anyway, I think I messed up on the dates, but 430 years shows to be the difference. I don't know how I did that. I must have confused some things, but I'll correct that for next time. 1 Kings 6:1 says it was 480 years exact from Israel leaving Egypt until the temple began. And the reason I want to include these longer, 430 and 480, is that if you're a chronologist trying to figure out important dates of the Bible, and God gives you a length of time from this to this is 430, and from this to this is 480, that gives you a big chunk of what you need right there. So you plug in those events of starting and ending at 430 and 480, and then you start adding in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, and then you add easily, we could even pick out different names, but the oral records that became the written records from Adam all the way to Enoch, then to Methuselah, and then there's the flood. And then Methuselah died the year of the flood, we're told. So it's given to Noah, and then to Shem, and then to Abraham. And then from there through Joseph and Moses, who had access also to Egyptian dates and records in the palace. It gives us confidence in their results. These people have worked really hard trying to establish these dates, and I have pretty good confidence in them. The holy feast days shows this exactness of time, and I just gave you the scriptures here about Passover, first fruits, Pentecost, tabernacles. You can read those yourself. But some of them are on like a date of the month, like Passover is the 14th day of the first month. So it changes days of the week each year, doesn't it? It's a different day of the week. But then there's a few of them like Pentecost and first fruits that are always on a Sunday. They're not just a date on a calendar, they're a day of the week after a particular starting point. So God's very precise. As the calendar went through its year and their holy feast days, they had no doubt. There was no guessing game. And there was no like, well, I'm busy that day. I think I'll kill the lamb on the 16th instead of the 14th. There was none of that. God wanted it exactly when he said. So you can look at those. And in these holy feast days, if you read through them, he mentions quite a bit about original creation, that part of the purpose of them was to look back at God as creator. So the 7 days from Adam through the millennial Sabbath rest, then the 8th day being the eternal ages. I like this thought. The seventh day is always necessary to enjoy and be ready for the eighth day. So then I go through this. I've already talked about it. One quick and simple way to show that day can mean 1,000 years in prophetic language is that Hosea's third day in 6:2 is clearly a resurrection, which many other verses always describes as being at the end of this age. What Jesus called, I will raise him up at the last day in John 6:40. Daniel describes as being after a time of great tribulation in chapter 12, 1 through 3. There'll be a time of trouble such as there never was since there's been a nation. And then people will rise up from the dead, as described in verse 2. What John calls exactly 1,000 years, 6 times in Revelation 20. So I conclude Hosea 6:2, the third day is the millennial, fitting well into the principle of 2 Peter 3:8, with the Lord one day is 1,000 years one day. Thus, if the third day refers to 1,000 years, the 2 days are 2,000 years. Now I want to stop here and just briefly look at this one page, Numbers in Revelation. Because one thing I'm trying to establish in all of these, someone asked me a while back, and then I read someone else that was trying their best to say the 1,000 years does not mean 1,000 years. It's a big round number that simply means a long period of time. And believe me, there's a lot of people who teach that the 1,000 years is symbolic of the church age, or between Christ's two comings. It just means a long period of time. It's not precise. You really can't. So what I did is I just sat down and I scanned through Revelation, and I just started writing down anytime there's a number. It could be a number of churches. It could be a number of candlesticks. It could be a number of years. It could be a number of people. But anytime there's a number, and we're not going to read through these. You take this home and look for yourself. But what I concluded at the end is that the vast majority, almost all of them, maybe a few of them you could say is symbolic, but the vast majority of examples of the use of numbers in Revelation appears to be literal, especially when it deals with time. And I think it's a really important point to make, because maybe the most symbolic book in the Bible, when it comes to numbers, especially in regarding time, is literal. And if it is that way in the most symbolic book of the Bible, then what is it in the rest of the Bible, if it is not exactness of time? So then back to the 3-page handout, I start with Daniel's vision of the 70 weeks. Our exact time of 490 years. This is as clear as day. There's no question about it. Some people try to work around it. But if you look at the verse I gave in 2 Chronicles 36:21, they violated 70 Sabbath years, which is 490 years. God said, let the land rest every 7th year. They didn't do it for 70 Sabbath years. So God says, okay, I always get my way, in case you don't know it. So since you skipped 70 Sabbath years of letting your land rest, I'll take you out of the land. And the land's going to rest, because I decreed that that's the way it has to be. So it's clear that's why they were in captivity for 70 years, because they had skipped 70 Sabbath years. So that's well established. So then in that context, then you take the 77s, the 70 weeks, and all he's doing is saying, now I'm going to give you 490 years, 70 Sabbath years of your future in this vision, in this prophecy. So if you look at it like that, it's 2 sets of 490 years, one past, one future. That kind of removes all doubt that the 77s are 70 sets of 7 years, 70 Sabbath years, 490 years. The first 69 weeks equal 483 years. And this is where Floyd Nolan Jones in his book really helped me out, because I used to try to have a starting point of 445 BC instead of 454 of the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus in Nehemiah 2:4-8. What Floyd Nolan Jones learned through more complete research is that Artaxerxes actually served as co-regent with his father for 9 years. That needs to be counted into that. So you add 9 years to the 445 that most people use, like Sir Robert Anderson and others. And then 454 BC, you move 483, the 69 weeks forward. There's no 0 year. It equals 30 AD, the year of Christ's death. Just real simple math. You don't have to figure in lunar years. You don't have to figure in the 30-day months. You don't have to figure in leap years. Sir Robert Anderson in his famous book does a lot of that, and it looks, it's great work. But it's like you have to work too hard at it, and then he still doesn't quite get to the death of Christ. But it's close. So here's the real simple equation at the end of that paragraph. 454 BC is the starting date, brings you to 0, and then Christ dies at 30 AD. That's 484 years, but you have to lessen it by 1, because from 1 to 0, 0 to 1 is not 2 years. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD. So it's not 2 years, it's 1 year. So you got to eliminate 1 year. It's 483 years, 69 weeks. Exact time from a decree to rebuild the city to the Messiah being cut off to the exact year, 483 years. That's pretty exact. So in Daniel 9:27, there's 1 week being the 70th week. And then that verse says, in the middle of the week. So that's why we have 2 periods of 3.5 years. The first part is triggered by a signing of the covenant between the Antichrist and Israel and his 10-nation confederation. The last half is triggered by the breaking of that covenant, a setting up of the abomination of desolation, concluding with the total collision of Antichrist and Christ, the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of godliness. And of course, who wins? Well, Revelation 19:11-21 describes that. Isn't it interesting? There are 7 separate passages, that prophetic number 7, specifying the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. But there's really 8 if we include Daniel 12:11. There's this principle in the Bible often. 7, but not really. There's 7, but 8. It's like one's tacked onto it or comes before. It's like 7, but I'm really talking about 8, because 8's always the number of new birth, regeneration of all things. And what God does is pretty amazing as you go through these 7 or 8 passages. So if you're only looking at Daniel, 7:25 and 12:7 mentions time, times, and half a time. So you think to yourself, well, okay, that might mean 3.5 years, but it might mean, it's like, okay, that's not the way we talk. So is it really 3.5 years? It could be something, it means something, it's a little bit vague. So what God makes John do in Revelation is to clarify, or to not clarify, but to solidify. When Daniel says time, times, and half a time, he means 3.5 years. Now, how does God do that in Revelation? Well, if you look at number 6, Revelation 12:14, he quotes Daniel. He says, this is time, times, and half a time. But what does he do? How does he surround that statement of time, times, and half a time? Other events happening at the same time. In number 3, he calls it 42 months. Number 4 and 5, he calls it 1,260 days. In number 7, 42 months. So on both sides of this time, times, and half a time that he quotes Daniel from, he's saying Time times and half a time is 1,260 days. It's 42 months. And why does God use three different time descriptors to talk about this period of time? Well, I've concluded it's God's way of saying, I know Revelation is symbolic. I know there's a lot of things in here that are you kind of spiritualize, but when it comes to time, it's literal, it's exact. So by using three different terms for the same length of time, it's kind of like he's shouting at us. Do not symbolize this. They're all three the same. 42 months is 42 months. 1,260 days is 1,260. And both of them are time times and half a time. So he's talking about a very specific period of time. But just in case we think we got it all worked out, God says, but I want to throw you a little curveball, just so you don't get too high and mighty and think you have all the answers. That's where Daniel 12:11 comes in. 1,290 days. Blessed is he comes then to the 1335, which I did not put in here. Most people say the 1,290 days extends it beyond this 30 days extra here. So it extends it out beyond the 1,260. I kind of come to the conclusion it actually might be talking about 30 days on this side. So in other words, the 1,290 and the 1,260 have the same ending point, but a different starting point. And I'll get into that at some point. So I've come to that conclusion. Be that as it may. It's almost like God saying, don't get over certain about all this. There's a little bit of variableness. And all of these 3.5 years is the same as when Satan is cast out by Michael in Revelation 12. He knows that he has a short time. That's Satan's short time. One thing that really stood out to me, I've never really thought about it this way before, but Jesus said, look to Daniel in Matthew 24:15. Look, he's basically saying, I'm not going to cover everything in Matthew 24. So if you want to know more details, go study Daniel. He could have said Isaiah, he could have said Jeremiah, he could have said Ezekiel. He could have said any of the prophets, but he said, look to Daniel. So evidently there are keys in Daniel that are not in any other book. One amazing thing to note about Daniel in the 7 days, if we're looking at the 7 days overall as 7,000 years, Daniel concluded his life and gave us his wonderful book of prophecy. I can't really draw it on that line. About 500 BC, which is interesting, isn't it? It's 3.5 days, 3.5 days, 3,500 years leading up to Daniel, 3,500 years. It's like God, for some reason, chose Daniel and said, I'm going to pluck him right in the half week, in the half of the 7, 3.5 and 3.5, if each is 1,000 years. So it's just one of those things that's fascinating to me that just kind of solidifies a lot of this. Christ's birth was an exact time. In due time, he was born of a woman. He was born exactly when he was supposed to. His death was an exact time. In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. He died on the correct Passover day in the correct year so that there could be 3 days and 3 nights before first fruits on Sunday. So since Passover changes days of the week each year, but first fruits has to be a Sunday. So God had to choose the correct year for all that to work out. He was able to follow his own sovereign predestined timeline, and I quote Acts 2:23, him being delivered by the determined counsel and foreknowledge of God, and still allow man's free will. This is one of the amazing things that God is able to do is his sovereignty is firm, but he still allows man's free will. So they were still able to carry out their plans to kill him so that they could still be guilty of premeditated murder. And so Peter says in Acts 3:13-15, that's when he says, you have taken by lawless hands and you have murdered the Prince of Life. So in their minds, they were operating of their own decisions and free will, but God's timetable, sovereign plan was being worked out at the same time. So neither one was violated. Their free will was not being violated. God's sovereignty was not being violated. And he does a lot of that regarding the second coming. His resurrection was an exact time on first fruits, the Sunday after Passover and Sabbath. And I like this thought. Just as he was raised on the third day, we will be raised on the third day. Hosea 6:2. The return of Christ will be an exact day. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord, Zechariah 14:7, very possibly on a Jubilee, because on the Jubilee there is a trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month on the Day of Atonement. I just like to think the 7th, the last trump, will be blown in a Jubilee year, because that's the trumpet is not blown on the Day of Atonement in a regular year. The trumpet is only blown on the Day of Atonement on a Jubilee year. It's every 49 years. Ezekiel 39:8, wouldn't it be perfect if Christ came back on the Day of Atonement in a Jubilee year? Well, if all this exercise that we've gone through, the exactness of time, is halfway correct, that makes sense. That'd be a perfect day for him to come back. Ezekiel 39:8, surely is coming, it shall be done. This is the day of which I have spoken, that great day of God Almighty. So whether Jesus returns exactly 2,000 years or 2 days after his death and ascension of 30 AD is his call. But world conditions sure seem to be building to a climatic big change. So then I start talking about the World Economic Forum, and I already kind of covered that. It's very interesting. The Antichrist has his death and resurrection event at the 3.5-year point of the 7 years. Very similar and an imitation of Jesus dying and raising after a 3.5-year ministry, probably, along with his death happening about 3.5 days after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The Jews were told on the 10th day of the month, go pick a lamb, bring it to your house, keep it 3.5 days. On the 14th day, kill it. Christ as the Lamb of God entered Jerusalem on the 10th day of the month. On the 14th day, he was killed as the Lamb of God. Jesus, just like Jesus died outside the gate of Jerusalem. So he was tried inside Jerusalem, but he was taken outside the gate to be killed on Mount Calvary. Antichrist will meet his fate just outside of Jerusalem after his own triumphal entry. Isn't that his own triumphal entry? When he sits in the temple and declares himself to be God? Where is that? It's in Jerusalem. Daniel 11 talks a lot about the Antichrist coming in to conquer Jerusalem. He's going to try to make Jerusalem his capital city because he's the imitation Christ. He's trying to imitate everything about Christ that he can. And that's part of it. But when Christ comes back, splits the Mount of Olives, and the blood flows, and he destroys the Antichrist, it seems to describe in Daniel and other places that he's drawn Antichrist out of the city to try to prevent Christ from coming back. So he dies outside the gate. So the true great reset will only happen with the dramatic and powerful return of Christ to set things right. Our other text verse besides Habakkuk when we started was Acts 3:19-21 is the Bible's great reset. That's the verse that says, whom heaven must receive until the restoration of all things. And that's at his return. That's the great reset. The millennial is the great reset. Man will attempt his great reset. The Antichrist will attempt his great reset at the mark of the beast. But none of them will succeed. The great reset that will succeed is the one Christ does at his return. Psalm 102:18, you will arise and have mercy on Zion, for the time to favor her. Yes, the set time has come. I wonder if you'll quote that in the sky on the white horse, so that everyone will say, the set time has come. I'm back. I'm taking over. So 4 pages of information, rush through it. At least you have the information to study for yourself. I'm sure there are many, many other verses, events of the Bible that we could look at that deal with numbers and dates and time and years that could probably add several more pages. We didn't even look, other than that this one page in Revelation has some of it, but we didn't even include in this 3-page how that the number 3, the number 7, and the number 12. This one page has a lot of 7s and 12s, but 3, 7, and 12, we could find events all through the Bible that are 3 days, 3 years, 7 days, 7 years, 12 days, 12 years, whatever, these prophetic numbers, so that we could add a couple of more pages to what we already have. But this is sufficient, I think, to prove the point. And I am going to stop 5 minutes early on my part, and I'll open it up to you. What do you have? What do you have from everything thrown at you tonight?
I have a question. 4,000 years, calculated by Bishop Younger.
Bishop Usher, about 300 years ago. Yeah, he was an Anglican bishop who devoted his life to the study of history and dates and Bible events and genealogies. People back then, they paid full time to do stuff like that. And he was a brilliant man, so he did it. And a lot of our Bibles still have those dates of Bishop Usher. I grew up as a kid. The Bible I had, it said Bishop Usher, in my center column has this date. I didn't know who the guy was. But when I grew up and started studying on my own, I read a lot of historians and chronologists tried to prove him wrong. So that's one reason I like this Floyd Nolan Jones book. He may be still alive, or maybe just died a few years ago, but he's contemporary with us. So he's used modern methods to try to calculate these dates. And in this book, he claims he purposely did his research independent of Bishop Usher's information because he didn't want to be overly influenced by it. And he said he was amazed when he got done how much they agreed. So I'm putting a lot of confidence in those 2 men who studied it, and others have tried to prove them wrong. But, I don't get the idea that they studied this with the purpose, I'm going to line it up so there's 4,000 years. They just kind of reached that conclusion based on their research. You had more.
That was going to be